Welcome, students. So, this week we're going to talk about leadership again. So, we're going to kind of round out the topic of leadership. We have quite a bit of ground to cover, so let me just show you the agenda. We're going to talk about leader traits, we're going to talk about leader behaviors, and then we'll talk about some newer theories of leadership, and we'll end off by describing an exercise slash assignment that I'd like you to start thinking about now, and that will most likely take place online. All right, let's get going. So, let me show you a couple examples of some people, and I just want you to think about is this person a leader? Would you consider them to be a leader? So here we have Mahatma Gandhi. Leader, non-leader? Well, clearly a leader, I would say. Got a lot of people to follow him. May not have had any kind of real positional authority at the time. It wasn't the prime minister, it wasn't the leader. India was under British rule. Nonetheless, a lot of people followed his teachings and practices. So seems to be clearly a leader. How about this guy? President of the United States currently at the time of recording this video. So by position, if not by other means, certainly a leader. A lot of people follow what he preaches or practices. So he has certainly a lot of influence. Probably would consider him a leader for perhaps different reasons from Gandhi, although maybe not, maybe for the same reasons. We have Mark Zuckerberg here, CEO of Facebook. Is he a leader? So again, certainly as the positional authority. He's been in hot water a little bit of late, last few years. You may not know her. This is Marissa Mayer. She was the CEO of Yahoo for some time, and a rare example of a female CEO in a tech company. Had some very interesting, how do we say this? She famously gave birth and then was back at work within like a few days to sort of set an example of work ethic, I suppose. Although the flip side is sort of that's really hard to do. B, most men don't have to do that. Okay, so last one, Hitler. Probably not a very nice guy. Certainly did horrible, evil things. But you can't really deny that he was also a leader. He got a lot of people to follow him and galvanized the German people toward particular goals. So, these are all likely to be examples of leaders. Now, they may differ in terms of how they got done what they got done and the ends to which they use their influence. But we could all say that they're people who generally had influence, and that's kind of part of the core of leadership. Okay. Oh, and then we have this guy, another leader, former president of the United States, and influential in his own way as well. Okay. So the point of this is to have you guys think, well, what makes a leader a leader? And, well, a lot of people have considered this question for a long time. So perhaps throughout the history, certainly throughout human history, and then probably before history as well, people have wondered, well, what makes certain people leaders and other people not? And so initially, the first kind of working theory, and again, this goes back literally thousands of years, was that leaders are great men who are born to be leaders, all right? And they're almost always men, okay, which it just sort of tells you about some of the kind of sexist history of leadership thinking. And again, they're born. They're not created. They're not trained. They don't learn how to be leaders. They're just born with some ineffable quality that makes them have tremendous influence over other people, whereas other people are not born with that quality, okay, and therefore will never be leaders. So this is the kind of initial thinking about leadership. And, some of it was really structured that way, meaning, you had monarchies where you literally had to be born into the right family to be a leader, that there was a sort of noble blood that led to some people being leaders and others not, and that was kind of used to justify these structures. So you have a ruling family, and they have more power and wealth than everybody else in the country or whatever it is we're talking about. And so the way to justify that is to say, well, we have royal blood, which means that we have a certain quality of leadership that the rest of you do not. Okay, so it started off kind of almost literally that you had to be born into the right family to be a leader. But then it kind of later became more about, it doesn't matter, it's not necessarily tied to your family or bloodlines, but that there is some kind of internal stuff that makes some people able to be leaders and other people not able to be leaders. In other words, that there were some innate traits that differentiated people who were good leaders from people who were not good leaders. Okay, so it's not, again, not family tied, but it's still internal. It's not learned, it's built into the individual. Okay, and so, oh, and by the way, here's a nice joke. Behind every great man is a woman rolling her eyes. Okay, I think it's quite appropriate. But so the idea that leaders had certain things that others didn't, that are internal, was the starting off point for much of the scientific approach to studying leadership. So the first really kind of major school in studying leadership was focused on identifying traits that differentiated leaders from non-leaders. And so, I guess the kind of general sense of this research was after looking for, so the way that they approached this is they looked at people who became leaders and people who did not. So people who ended up in positions of leadership and people who did not. And they measured the traits of each of these two groups of people. And then they wanted to find, well, here are the traits that appear in the leader group but do not appear in the non-leader group. Okay, and so that would then allow them to say, well, these are the traits that are inherent to leadership. So you see them in leaders, but you don't see them in other people. Now, the results of that research suggested that there was no definitive pattern. So there's no universal set of traits that are associated with leadership and are not found in non-leaders. Okay, so there's no definitive pattern. There's no universal. It's not like all leaders are more extroverted, right? That's not the case. Now, there were some kind of tendencies. So leaders tended to be alert to the social environment. They tended to be dominant, have a strong power motive, and ambitious. They tended to be energetic and persistent. They tended to be intelligent. They tended to be self-confident, to tolerate stress, to be cooperative, to work collaboratively, to be decisive, dependable, to be willing to assume responsibility. So those were all tendencies, but again, there was no universal. So it's not like leaders have one of these things or any of these things necessarily. You might have a leader who has none of these qualities, okay? But generally speaking, on average, leaders tend to have these, some of these qualities, okay? So the key point here is that the early trait research showed there's no universal pattern of traits. In other words, there's nothing internal to leaders that necessarily differentiates them from non-leaders, okay? There are certain things that they may tend to have, but it's not a universal pattern, okay? So it's not clearly entirely internal what makes a leader compared to a non-leader. Okay. Now, so given the failure of traits, so okay, we know it's not just purely a function of some of people who have certain traits being leaders and others who don't have those traits not being leaders. So we know that's not the case. So maybe the differentiating factor is that leaders are have different motivation from non-leaders. And so there's a whole area of research on leadership that focused on managerial motivation. And this early research used things like the projective tests, essentially like the thematic apperception test, the TAT, thematic apperception test. So McClellan, for example, used this test to understand leader motivation. And I'll show you kind of like what this looks like in a second. But basically the results of this research showed that typically leaders have a high need for achievement. Well, we'll go into these, but let me kind of talk about what these are. McClellan identified 3 basic needs of human beings. And these are a need for achievement, a need for affiliation, and a need for power. Okay, and so McClelland argued that essentially or really all of us have these three needs, but in different strengths, right? So some people have a really strong need for achievement, some people not so strong. Some people have a really strong need for affiliation, others not so strong. Okay, need for achievement is basically you want to have success, you want to have, you want to do great things. Okay, need for affiliation is the need to be liked, to be accepted by other people, to have relationships with other people that are meaningful. And the need for power is to have, to have social power, to be able to influence other people, to have control over outcomes. Okay, so those are three fundamental needs according to McClelland. Now, the need for power takes a couple different forms. There is a socialized power orientation where you want to have power to kind of help other people and as a way of creating positive change for others. So it's socialized, it's directed towards the well-being of your group. And on the other hand, we have a personalized power orientation where people are seeking power in order to dominate others in a selfish manner. So you're seeking power in order to further your own goals, not the well-being of other people. Okay, and that's a really critical distinction. You can imagine that we want one of those two orientations in leaders, but not the other one. Okay, so the question was, how do we figure out if leaders have different levels of these three needs compared to non-leaders? And I mentioned this thematic apperception test. Let me show you what that looks like. So this is basically what you would be shown as a participant in this research. So you're shown a kind of ambiguous picture, and then you're asked to come up with a short story to describe what's happening in the picture. Okay, so we'll do this right now. I'd like each of you to just take a minute, look at this picture, try to figure out what's going on, and then I'd like you to write a short story, just, a 10-second story, whatever you want it, however long you want it to be, jot it down. Okay, I'm just going to wait here for you to do this. Okay, so, what you would do as a person who is administering this thematic apperception test is you would listen to the story and then you'd try to find themes in the story, and those themes are meant to say something about your own motivation. Okay, so for example, if I said, well, what's happening here is this is this kid, and this is his dad, and his dad had failed to keep the kid safe, and the kid died of COVID-19 or whatever, and now he's really upset and feels really guilty about what happened. Okay, so if that's my story for this picture, then the administrator of the thematic apperception test would try to interpret what that means or what it says about my own motivation. So it might say, well, I have a strong motivation, I have a strong need for affiliation, like it's very important for me to take care of my children, or I have a strong need for power, I need to have control over things that essentially are uncontrollable. So you would kind of make inferences about the person's motivation. Okay, now the problem with this test, as you might imagine, is the success of it is really dependent on whoever's administering the test. Not even the success, but whatever they, it's might say as much about whoever's administering the test and trying to interpret the answers of the person who took the test as it does about those answers themselves. So there's a lot of subjectivity. So it doesn't, it's not a very reliable test, and we don't really use it so much anymore. But anyway, that's kind of what they did back then. And the results of these manager motivation studies were fairly informative. So they found that within large organizations, managers tended to have a high socialized need for power. So they want to have power to help other people. They have a moderate need for achievement, so they want to achieve success, but not too much, so they're not super high on this. And they have a low need for affiliation. So these are not people who are concerned about making friends. All right, it's the reality TV thing of like, I'm not here to make friends. I didn't come here to make friends, right? So that's the idea. To be successful in a large organization as a manager, you can't be too concerned with forming relationships with other people. You have to be willing to make the tough decisions, which makes some sense. Now, and there were some different results for owners of small businesses who tended to only, relative to other people, only tended to have a high need for achievement. So they didn't really differ in terms of the other two needs. The thing that differentiated owners of small business were this sort of high need for achievement. Okay, all right. So that's useful. Now, another approach to understanding what differentiated managers from leaders comes in the form of what's called assessment center research. And in particular, a very famous study that took place at AT&T over, a very long time. And basically what they did in this research with the AT&T longitudinal study was that they administered some assessments early on, and then to these group of employees, and then they followed them for the next 20 years. And we're interested to see what things that they measured initially predicted outcomes 20 years later. So that's a really nice study because you have longitudinal data. Often we don't have the patience to run that kind of study. It just takes too long. Like your career would be almost over by the time the study was over. But the nice thing about AT&T was that it was a huge company. They had people in-house who were kind of habitually collecting all of this data. So that made it possible for them to track people for 20 years. Plus, at the time, it was fairly normal for somebody to stay at a single company for that long. Meaning, people, this was back in the day where people were hired for essentially like career employment. So you were hired by AT&T and, odds on you would stay with that company your entire career. So it's just a different, you wouldn't be able to do that nowadays, most likely, because people just aren't staying with one company that long anymore. So anyway, good thing that this happened when it did. And basically what they found was, and they simply looked at, well, compared to people who didn't progress up the hierarchy in the company, what differentiated people who were successful in terms of moving up the hierarchy compared to those who were not? And they identified several factors. So the people who became high-level leaders had a greater desire for advancement. They had higher dominance or a need for power. So linking back to McClelland's three needs, need for power. They had greater interpersonal skills, which isn't to say they necessarily had a higher need for affiliation. They were just good at navigating interpersonal relationships. They were good at talking to people, at understanding people, at getting people on your side, those kinds of things. They had strong cognitive skills, particularly critical thinking, okay, and they had good administrative skills, planning and organizing, etc. Now, what's interesting about this is that you don't really see much on, it's interesting to see what's missing from this list. So it's not like the most competent managers, the ones who had the most, maybe highest level of job performance, for example, were more likely to advance. So it wasn't really about that. It was more of these kind of general skills, a lot of them what we would call soft skills, like having good interpersonal skills, having good cognitive skills, administrative skills, right? So that's sort of interesting. Now, the other thing that's important is it wasn't all just about the particular things that the managers themselves had, but we also had an effect for the job situation. So managers who were encouraged to develop, who were given challenging assignments, for example, they also tended to be more successful. So it's not just about what's internal to the person. This kind of assessment center research, particularly from the AT&T longitudinal study, showed that, yeah, it's not just internal to the leader, it's like some external factors too. So if you happen to be groomed for success, if somebody took an interest in you and believed in you and challenged you and encouraged you to develop, then you were much more likely to be successful. So we shouldn't just look at the leader or the traits of the leader or the characteristics of the leader to understand their career path. We have to think about the job situation too. Okay, and so again, this assessment center research was really focused on figuring out what predicted success, career success as a high-level leader. Now, we also have research from kind of like the other side of the coin, which is studying a phenomenon called derailment. So by derailment, we mean a leader, usually it's a high-level executive leader who has a certain career trajectory, so they're doing well up to a point, and then all of a sudden they experience some kind of failure that derails, takes them off the path towards success. So that's what we mean by derailment. And the Center for Creative Leadership in North Carolina has done a lot of this research. Let me give you an example. So fairly recently, Elon Musk tweeted something about taking Tesla private or something along those lines. And, there have been a couple tweets that have had some negative effects for Elon Musk, as well as a case of using a semi-illegal drug on a podcast. So anyway, all of these behaviors have kind of hurt Tesla in various ways, particularly in terms of their stock value. So, CCL and others have looked at, well, what is it that predicts derailment? So can we figure out, are there certain aspects or certain characteristics of leaders that tend to predict their own derailment, or is it something else? So what they've found in this research is that people who are more likely to derail tend to have lower emotional stability. They tend to be defensive, meaning not accepting of negative feedback, protective of their self-identity, not kind of flexible in terms of acknowledging their own weaknesses and trying to improve them. So they tend to be defensive. They tend to have uncertain integrity, meaning that they're willing to cut corners and engage in some dodgy behavior that may not be ethical. All right. They tend to have poor interpersonal skills. Interestingly, again, there's really no difference in technical or cognitive skills between those who derail and those who don't. So it's not that people who derail tend to not be competent or tend to not be smart enough. That's not it at all. Elon Musk, very smart, very technically competent person. That's not what's predicting derailment. Derailment is, again, about these soft skills. So emotional stability, emotional awareness, being defensive, being open to feedback or not open to feedback, acting ethically, right? Behaving according to ethical standards, having good interpersonal skills. So the ethics piece is really important because often, we're going to talk about ethics, but you can argue that we should behave ethically from a few different perspectives. One is just, the right thing to do is the right thing to do, and that's why we should do it. And certainly I value and appreciate that perspective. But another perspective is we should behave ethically because it's in our best interest to do that as individuals in the long term. And so, this is one example of why that's true. So, of course, you should do the right thing to do because it is the right thing to do. But also, it's in your benefit to do that. You should do that because that's the right thing to do for your career as well. Okay? Okay. So, that kind of wraps up that initial set of research, or the initial perspective on understanding leadership, which is that there's something internal to the leaders that makes them special. And we know now that really, yes, there are certain traits that are associated with leadership, but that's certainly not sufficient to explain who becomes a leader. And we can think of that assessment center data particularly as evidence that actually the situation matters too. But anyway, so basically, we'll shift into a different approach to leadership, which was that, well, okay, so maybe we can't really figure out what's internal to people that makes them a leader versus a non-leader. So let's just actually study what leaders do. So that really shifted the focus to trying to understand behaviors that leaders engage in. So what do leaders actually do? So let me show you a quick video.
We have got to cut costs, people. Ideas.
We could open an account on FedEx.com, save 10% on online express shipping.
Okay, how about this? We open an account on FedEx.com, we save 10% on online express shipping.
That is wonderful. You just said the same thing I said, only you did this.
No, I did this.
Makes all the difference.
Bingo. That's good.
Right on the nose.
That's a great idea.
All right, so that's kind of a joke, but it illustrates the importance of behaviors for leaders, right? It's not just about what you say, what you do, okay? So, again, this is a little bit different from the traits approach to leadership. Here we're really focused on observing leaders, seeing what they do, okay? And what they found, what some of these initial researchers from the Behavior School of Leadership found, was that when you're looking at managers and leaders, this is the nature of the work that they do. There's a hectic pace, so things are happening quickly. There's fragmented work, so that means that you're not like sitting there working on the same thing for 3 hours in a row. You're constantly interrupted dealing with different issues throughout the day. Tends to be reactive and not strategic. So rather than having a strategic vision that you're pursuing in a systematic way, you're kind of like reacting to different things that are happening that are outside of your control. So you're maybe more like putting out fires than trying to build something from a plan in your head. Okay, there tends to be a lot of interactions with others. So good leaders especially are really good at just kind of walking around and touching base is a sports term, but like checking in with people, trying to make sure that you have a good understanding of what's happening on the ground in your organization. And so there's a lot of like kind of network building with peers as well. So it's not just interacting with your subordinates and with other people, and it's kind of random. Again, it's not systematic. It's random. It's just sort of all happening. There's an important oral communication component. So at this time, certainly leaders tended to have conversations with a lot of different people throughout the day. Maybe this is a little different now with the general shift to email, and then especially given that we're sort of in quarantine at this moment, where not a lot of people are physically going to work compared to before. There tends to be disorderly and political decision-making rather than, again, strategic decision-making. So again, there's a lot of randomness. Politics is involved. Planning is informal rather than formal. So, it kind of paints this picture of a pretty random, fragmented, chaotic, fast-paced, and relationship-based workplace. And that's kind of what leaders are good at. Leaders are good at operating in that kind of environment. Okay. And so some of these early studies from the 1950s, like the Ohio State study and some others at Michigan, essentially they looked at leaders, they observed leaders, and they tried to boil down all the different behaviors that leaders engage in into as few categories as they could possibly come up with that made sense. And basically what they found is that every leader behavior could be boiled down and categorized into just two categories. And these categories, Ed Fleischman and others in these studies, labeled as initiating structure and consideration. So by initiating structure, they meant that one thing leaders do in all different kinds of ways is they create structure for their followers' jobs. They set goals. They organize the work of the employee. They help them organize their time. They help them figure out how to do their job, right? Okay, so that's initiating structure. So it's a kind of task-related behavior, okay? The other category of things that leaders do in a lot of different ways are they demonstrate individualized consideration. They talk to their employees as individuals. They discuss their needs. They try to understand their strengths and weaknesses. So it is a relationship-based category of behavior. So everything that leaders do, say the Ohio State leadership researchers, boils down to either task-related, in other words, initiating structure for their employees, or individualized consideration or relationship-related. So you can kind of boil everything down into these two buckets. A very similar type of research program at Michigan found essentially the same thing. Leaders engage in task-related behaviors, and they engage in relationship maintenance type behaviors, okay? Mizumi and Peterson essentially found the same thing. There are performance-related behaviors, and then there are maintenance, meaning relationship maintenance type behaviors. So that's really important. So we know that leaders engage in these two different kinds of behaviors, and that both of them are important. So you can't be an effective leader if you're only focused on creating structure for your followers in terms of the tasks that they have to do, ignoring the relationship part. That's not going to be successful. Similarly, you can't be an effective leader focusing solely on building strong relationships with your employees without helping them on the task side of things. So you have to do both to be an effective leader, is the kind of general conclusion of the leader behavior studies. Okay, and now we do have, and this was 70 years ago, but we do have newer evidence for the importance of these leader behaviors. So Judge et al. In 2004 conducted a meta-analysis of 130 leadership studies at the time and found that, well, there's actually quite a lot of evidence for the importance of these two different categories of behavior on a number of outcomes. So in terms of job satisfaction, consideration, individualized consideration is important. Initiating structure is not unimportant, but it's less important. Follower satisfaction, hugely impacted by relationship maintenance behaviors, less impacted, but still pretty high effect for task-related behaviors. Follower motivation, both are important, but relationship-oriented behaviors are a little bit more important. Leader job performance, so how well the leader performs, they're both equally important. Group and organizational performance, they're both basically equally important. Leader effectiveness, which is kind of more perceptual on the part of the followers. Relationship is more important than initiating structure. But you see that both are important. There's no outcome here for which neither of these behaviors is important. So it's important for all of them. And they're pretty close. I mean, they're pretty equal in terms of their importance. Maybe you would say relationship-oriented behaviors are even more important for some of these outcomes compared to initiating structure. But I think the main conclusion is that they're both really important. So if you're going to be an effective leader, you have to be able to do both of these two types of behaviors effectively. Okay, so now you may have taken the leadership assessments, and one of the assessments was on your orientation towards task versus and relationship oriented leader behaviors. So you had a score for your task orientation and for relationship orientation. Here are the means for Management 370 students. Okay, for each. So the mean for task orientation was 36.4. The mean for relationship orientation, 39.4. And high scores and low scores are also shown here. +1 standard deviation is the kind of arbitrary benchmark for a high score, -1 standard deviation for a low score. So that gives you some idea. And then also for this particular scale, there are kind of built-in categories to interpret the scores, and those are, 10. If you scored 10 to 25, anywhere in there, you were very low on either task or relationship, depending on which one we're talking about. If you score between 40 and 44, you were high on that. So that's another way to kind of think of it. And so the other, way to think of this is that essentially, in terms of the average for 370 students, on average, 370 students are already moderately high on both task orientation and relationship orientation. So those two averages kind of fall right within that 35 to 39 category. So that's good, I guess, right? Okay. Let's talk about the third major category here, which is transformational and charismatic leadership. We won't really have time to talk about authentic and servant leadership, although those are interesting perspectives, but we probably just won't have time to get to those. So we're focusing on transformational and charismatic leadership. Here's a guy, Steve Jobs, many people thought was charismatic. Okay, so what do we mean by charismatic? Well, this is the question that I want you guys to just think about here. So what makes a leader charismatic? And I'm assuming most of you have heard that term. So charisma is this kind of like personal magnetism and kind of special ability to influence other people. Okay, so what makes a leader charismatic? And then what does a charismatic leader, or I should say, how does a charismatic leader influence other people? Those are two questions I want you to just think about now. And I'd ask you at this point to just generate answers to these questions in your head. And we may follow up with this with an exercise online. So again, what makes a leader charismatic, and how does a charismatic leader influence other people? So just think of answers to these two questions. Okay. So let's talk about charismatic leadership theory. So Bob House, proposed the initial theory here, and essentially the idea was that leadership was about a follower's belief in the leader and their emotional connection to him or her. And that's kind of the basis for charismatic leadership. So charismatic leaders are able to get people to believe in them and to have some kind of emotional connection to them. It's focused on social identification and internalization. So, followers socially identify with the leader. They feel like, they're in the same social group, and they internalize the leader's message. So it's not just, this is what I do for work, but what the leader is saying is a part of me. It's part of my self-concept. It's an important value that I have, not work-related, right? So it becomes personal. It becomes internalized, becomes part of who you are. And there's a strong situational component to charismatic leadership, where typically charismatic leaders arise when there is a situation in which you have a crisis. So that's very common. We don't really need charismatic leaders except when there's a crisis. And when there's a crisis, we tend to seek them out. Okay. And in particular, when there is congruence between your values and the values that the leader is espousing. Okay. So that's kind of the situation that typically happens. So you have a company, for example, in decline, or they experience some kind of specific crisis that they have to cope with. Maybe new leaders, a new leader is brought in to cope with the crisis and to guide the organization through the period of change. That leader, if they're going to be effective, often is charismatic. So they're really influential. They get people to buy into their vision for change and a way of addressing this crisis, and people really kind of identify with them. And they may successfully get the organization through the crisis. But then once the crisis diminishes, then you kind of have this other weird thing that happens, which is that people kind of it becomes routine. So the charisma doesn't really have the effect that it used to, because you don't have the crisis anymore. So it's less urgent. You don't really identify as much. And often at that point, companies look for a new leader to kind of take over the more bureaucratic, day-to-day type issues that tend to be the main concerns for leaders when you're not in a crisis. So you have to really kind of think about succession planning. If you're going to bring in a charismatic leader, somebody whose influence is based very much on social identification, internalization, that's very much driven by crisis situations. Like you need the crisis for people to buy into the leader. Then once that crisis is gone, that leader might be less effective or less needed. Okay. And there are some potential downsides to charismatic leaders as well that we'll talk about. Okay, so the consequences of a charismatic leader would include followers who are highly motivated, and that can be a good thing. But the problem is that sometimes you have charismatic leaders who have selfish motivation, right? Or who are unethical, or who otherwise create problems through their charisma. Okay, and so this is what we call in leadership research the dark side of charisma. So like Jay Conger, for example, I think coined that term. And the idea here is that when you have a really charismatic leader who's very influential and people love the leader and buy into the leader's vision and very much identify with the leader and adore the leader, and the problem with that kind of adulation and strong influence is that it can cause the leader to lose touch with reality. So if you have this, you're kind of presenting your message and people really love you and identify with you, and kind of their self is tied up in what you're saying, like that's kind of a lot of pressure, right? You have all these people kind of adoring you and giving you all this feedback, and you might start to buy your own hype, right? You might start to believe, hey, I really am this amazing special person, and I maybe everybody thinks I'm a genius and I can do no wrong, so maybe they're right. Maybe I am a genius and I can do no wrong. And you kind of start losing touch with reality, particularly when you have maybe some communication issues or feedback processes where like nobody's willing to kind of tell you the truth or even see the truth, because you've created all of this momentum around who you are. Okay, so that's a real risk there. And of course, if you lose touch with reality, there are all kinds of major problems that can happen. And it's not so unusual. I mean, certainly you could think of a lot of examples of CEOs who have made public statements that are just sort of so head-scratchingly out of touch with the experience of their employees, that they really just don't understand what's going on, okay? So it's a real problem. A strong personal vision that often these charismatic leaders have can lead to having a strong vision is good generally. You should have a vision. You should know where you're going as a leader. But if you're so strongly and personally attached to your vision, and so many other people are so strongly and personally attached to your vision, then it doesn't really allow you to shift, to change, to react to on the ground reality, to changes in situations. So you have a lack of flexibility when it comes to your vision, and essentially an escalation of commitment. So you've already sort of committed to the course of action that you've taken, and you're getting maybe some evidence that it's not working, but everyone believes in you. Everyone believes in your vision. You believe in your vision. You think you're this special person. You can't backtrack now, right? So that puts you in a position where you are sticking with a vision or a plan or whatever it is that isn't going to work, but you're not able to detach from it. Okay, that's a real problem. Charisma, your own influence, can become a vehicle for pure personal gain. So rather than proposing things that are to the advantage of the organization or in the best interest of the organization, your vision becomes a vehicle for just your own personal success. Okay, so everything that you're doing is not about making the organization successful or making employees a party to that success, but it's about your own individual personal agenda. Okay, and that's a real risk factor with charisma, because it's hard to, when you have people who are really identified personally with the leader and bought into everything that they're spouting, that it's hard for them to recognize that the leader in fact is unethical or is selfish or is only out for themselves. Like, it becomes very difficult to notice that, because you've invested so much in this person. You believe in this person. So, the reality that they may be in it only for themselves, it's just hard to register that because of the investment that you've made. There's a process called cognitive dissonance, whereby when we engage in behaviors that run counter to our attitudes, we tend to, over time, change our attitudes, because the behaviors are much harder to change. Like, it's much easier to change our attitudes than to change our behaviors. So, in other words, I've decided that I am, a big believer in Elon Musk, and he's a genius and he would never do anything wrong. And so when I see these examples of like tweets that tank the stock market or whatever, I might just say, well, that wasn't his fault, or that's the media overblowing the effects, or, everyone's out to get him because they're jealous, right? So like, you wouldn't necessarily, it's easier to change your attitudes around those things than to change the behavior. You've already committed. You've already put a lot of effort into this relationship with this leader. So, it's much harder to disconnect from that and change course than it is to just change your thoughts around what's going on. Okay. And particularly damaging is when you have a charismatic leader who's narcissistic, because, a narcissistic person is only concerned about themselves and can only see the world in terms of themselves. Okay. That's a real problem with high-level leaders. Narcissistic leaders tend to be very destructive in a lot of different ways. You have lies, you have, deception designed to maintain the leader's position or vision, or, maintain other people's belief in the leader. They're motivated to maintain this group of followers who are highly committed. So distorting reality, lying about reality, and then just distorting reality. So there's a difference between like, what's going on in reality, and you kind of describe it in a way that's inaccurate as a way to change people's attitudes. That's a lie. But reality distortion is when you actually, are not viewing reality as it is, but you're distorting it before it even gets into your head. Okay. And so that sounds extreme, but this certainly happens with leaders like this. Okay. Corruption. So, willingness to cut any corners in order to essentially to kind of benefit themselves personally. And you have what are called personality cults. So people who are identified with the leader not because of what they do, but because of who they are. And so if you're part of a personality cult where you believe that a leader is, infallible just based on who they are, then they literally can do no wrong. And that's, again, a very dangerous position to find yourself in, because, well, any human being is going to make mistakes. And, we have to evaluate people based on what they do more than anything else, particularly in business. We don't want to sort of hire people based on just who they are, irrespective of what they do. Of course, we want people to do things. We should evaluate people's behaviors. Okay. Now, to some of you, this might sound kind of familiar. Um, so transformational leadership is another theory that kind of expands on charismatic leadership. So Bernie Bass and Bruce Avolio propose this. They describe transformational leadership somewhat problematically in terms of some outcomes. So basically, transformational leaders are able to produce performance beyond expectations from their followers. They tend to be able to transcend self-interest among their followers for the sake of the organization. So employees of transformational leaders are able to kind of do things that aren't necessarily in their own self-interest for the benefit of the organization because they believe in the vision. So I'm going to work harder. I'm going to stay late at work, even though I don't have to, because I really believe in the mission, right? They called it the great democratizer of this era in the sense that anybody could be a transformational leader. You don't have to be in a position of authority to be a transformational leader. So anybody at any level can engage in transformational leadership behaviors and get performance beyond expectations. Okay, that's the kind of general idea. And they contrasted transformational leadership with transactional leadership, and I'll kind of describe each of those in turn. But let's start with transactional leadership. So transactional leadership is based on an exchange relationship. And this is usually, maybe this is traditionally how people think about employment relationships. So I hire you and I ask you to do X, Y, and Z, and in return I pay you a salary and I give you benefits, etc. Okay, so it's an exchange relationship. You do X for me and I give you Y. It's an exchange. The form of exchange is negotiable, so everyone has a contract. You can negotiate that contract. But it's not merely limited to economic exchange. So there's also, that's part of it, but we also have social exchanges or exchanges of psychological resources. So, it's also like I'm working here, I'm working for you because you support me socially. You think I'm a good person. You treat me respectfully. Like none of that is in a contract, but that also is an important part of the transaction. Okay. The trade is of mutual benefit and it's constrained by modal values or social norms pertaining to fairness, justice, etc. So you might kind of agree to work for somebody and get paid a lot of money, but if they treat you disrespectfully or if they violate norms about what work should be like, then you may not be okay with that, even though you're getting paid a lot. Okay, and so we think about often a contract when considering an employment relationship, and a lot of people have a contract that dictates like, here's the work that I do and here's how much you compensate me. But it goes beyond like that kind of economic contract and it's more of a psychological contract. So we're not just working in exchange for compensation and benefits. We're working in exchange, like we're engaging in a kind of implicit psychological contract that we don't necessarily describe out loud, but we all feel like there are certain things that have to happen. You need to respect me as an individual. You can't be abusive. You have to be a certain level of trustworthy, and et cetera, et cetera. Like there are these psychological aspects to our agreement to work that are also important. And so that's all part of transactional leadership. So again, psychological contract is implicit. It's informal. We don't talk about it. We don't necessarily even think about it, but it's very important. Okay, so that's transactional leadership. Now, transformational leadership is quite different from that. Transformational leadership involves an appeal to a follower's sense of values beyond their own personal interests. So it's values-based. It's not about like you do this for me and I'll do this for you. It's not about that. It's saying we're all working towards this mission or vision and the reason for that is that it's the right thing to do. It sort of is a function of the values that we all share. And transformational leaders are kind of like power wielders, so they secure a commitment from their followers that satisfies the leaders and the organization's ideally interests rather than the followers' interests. Okay, typically they're really able to effectively reframe the work that followers are doing in terms of kind of persuading followers that they need to align their values with the values of the leader and the organization, as opposed to focusing on their own individual values that might be different. Okay, so again, it's getting people to really buy into the value-based importance of the work that they're doing beyond any transactions that are going on, right? So I believe in the work that I'm doing because I think it's good work, it's the right thing to do. And that is beyond any kind of consideration of what you're paying me or what benefits I'm getting from this relationship. Okay, and so there are specific dimensions associated with this, with each of the two types. So transactional leadership has 4 dimensions. There's laissez-faire, which is basically kind of like not even transactional. So laissez-faire leaders just don't do anything. They kind of just let things pass. Laissez-faire is French for let it happen, I guess. So it's not even really transactional. It's kind of a separate dimension, but it's typically assessed with transactional leadership. Then you have passive. MBE is management by exception. Okay, so management by exception is when things happen that aren't supposed to, that prompts you to act as a leader. So passive management by exception is putting out fires. So when mistakes arise, then you deal with them, only then. Okay, so it's very reactive. You're waiting for something to go wrong, and only then are you acting to deal with that problem. That's passive management by exception, and hopefully it's clear that that's not terribly effective. Okay, active management by exception is a little bit better, where you're, instead of waiting for mistakes to happen, you're searching for them. So you're looking for future mistakes or potential mistakes, and you're kind of coping with them proactively. So it's better because it's proactive, but it's still sort of also not ideal because you're really dealing on a granular level with potential problems and kind of putting out fires, but in advance. Okay, so it's not great, but it's better than passive. And then we have contingent reward, which is this idea of like when there is good performance, you reward that good performance. So you make rewards contingent on performance. Okay, and that's also good, but kind of limiting. So if you're focused too much on rewards as a way of motivating followers, then in the absence of a reward, the followers aren't really necessarily going to do anything. So it's better to reward performance than to punish it, certainly, but it's also pretty limited in terms of the influence that you can have. And we contrast that with transformational leadership. Here are 4 dimensions as well. Individualized consideration, where we treat our employees as individuals and focus on employee relationships. Does that sound familiar to an earlier theory that we talked about? Hopefully it does. So that's the consideration dimension of the leader behaviors theory, right? So we had task focused and relationship focused orientations or categories of leader behaviors. So this is basically pulled from that theory, individualized consideration. We also have idealized influence. So this is where leaders are able to influence people based on the values and the mission of the organization. So having these important values, expressing them, getting people to buy into them, that's idealized influence. So you're influencing people not on the like transactional, you do this for me, I do that for you, but on this higher level in terms of values. We have inspirational motivation, which is basically having high standards for employees, having a future orientation. It's a little bit like task orientation, where you're creating structure, you're setting goals for people, you're having high standards, high expectations. But it's also incorporates a kind of future orientation aspect to it. So you're thinking ahead, you have a vision, you have a plan, you have a strategy, right? So future thinking. And then we have intellectual stimulation. So this is where, transformational leaders tend to be accepting of new ideas. They tend to challenge the status quo. They tend to think, right? So it involves thinking. So it's intellectual stimulation. Okay, so are they opposite? Is transformational leadership the opposite of transactional? Are you one or the other? The answer to both of these questions is no, they're not opposite. They're different from each other, but they're not opposite. And it's not like you only want transformational leaders and you don't want transactional leaders. In fact, there are aspects of both that are important. Clearly you have greater potential to influence people if you're a transformational leader compared to transactional. But if you only have transformational leadership, then you may be missing some things that are important. So there may be aspects of transactional leadership that are complementary to transformational leadership. Okay. So if we think about, again, the leadership assessments, you completed an assessment of transformational and transactional leadership here. And so here are the averages of Management 370 students on these assessments. Okay, and I want you to kind of just think about, what are your strengths and weaknesses as a leader? So based on this assessment, the other assessment, where are your strengths? Where are your weaknesses in terms of transformational and transactional leadership? Just sort of think about this And, again, you have a final cumulative assignment where you're going to kind of reflect on your strengths and weaknesses as a manager and think ahead in your career. And so this could be an important part of, or could become an important part of that assignment. So again, reflect on and think about using these scores. What are your strengths as a leader? What are your weaknesses as a leader? And again, recognize that, you don't want to, like laissez-faire, the scores are low here. That's good. You don't want to, have a high score on laissez-faire leadership, because that just means you don't do anything as a leader. So, you want these scores to be low. So actually this one, the interpretation is flipped a little bit. You want to be low on laissez-faire leadership. You probably want to be low on passive MBE as well. The other two you might want to be high on. Okay, and then certainly for the transformational leadership dimensions, you probably want to be high on all of those too. Okay. So in terms of what transformational leadership is composed of, so we talked about the different dimensions, but there are some specific things that transformational leaders do. So they tend to have a credible vision. So they have an idea of where they want the company to go that's different from where the company is now. They tend to value personal credibility, meaning like that, you have to have credibility to be effective as a transformational leader. So if you haven't built that credibility, you're not going to be successful. Okay, you need to be perceived as trustworthy. That's to say, again, you need to be perceived as trustworthy. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily trustworthy. People just have to believe you are. You've got to have clear values and higher order goals that you're trying to achieve. You got to be a great communicator, and that includes having particular rhetorical skills. So like using words in an effective way is important. And a lot of transformational leaders engage in idealized behaviors. So these are kind of like symbolic behaviors. Things that maybe are meant to demonstrate a certain thing to followers, but you wouldn't otherwise do them, right? So it's symbolic. It's idealized. Okay, so the leader, for example, who agrees not to take any salary, right, as a commitment to, or as demonstrating their commitment to cost-cutting measures, for example, right? So that's an idealized behavior. Okay, let's think about how do we create change in organizations, and hopefully you see the link here that transformational leaders are really about changing. That's what we mean by transformational. So leaders who are transformational are transforming the beliefs of their followers and thereby changing their organizations. So the effectiveness of transformational leaders, kind of like charismatic leadership, is based on characteristics of the internal and external situation, as well as the leader's vision. So like charismatic leadership, transformational leaders tend to be more effective when there's some kind of external situation that's a crisis. Okay, and that, or an internal situation that's a crisis. And that their effectiveness is based on their vision for how to get out of this crisis. How do we move forward? How do we become successful? And, part of that is being able to deliver their vision to their followers. And so we know from a bunch of research on this that certain things are associated with effective delivery, including using direct gaze, so staring at people, looking at people, as opposed to looking away. Expressing positive emotions like enthusiasm, using imagery, so creating mental pictures, using metaphors to explain ideas, using concrete words rather than abstract words, being very clear, being very confident, framing issues in particular ways. So some of these things we've talked about before in other contexts. Okay, in terms of the external situation, there being a sense of an actual or imminent crisis occurring is beneficial to transformational leaders. There being a perceived need for change is beneficial. Okay, you're more willing to buy into a leader's vision when you feel like the way we do things now is not working. Okay, and this external crisis also provides an opportunity to articulate an ideological goal or a way to kind of change things, right? So it's an opportunity. When there are dramatic symbols available, so for example, right now, we could think of images of, freezer trucks piling up outside hospitals as thousands of people die from the coronavirus as a very dramatic symbol that might suggest that a change in approach is warranted, right, in the country. And it also provides an opportunity to articulate followers' roles. So, in this situation that we find ourselves in, there is an opportunity for a transformational leader to come in and articulate, like, okay, we're in this crisis, this coronavirus crisis right now. We all know that things are, well, I think a lot of people are aware that things are not going well, particularly compared to other countries. So it's an opportunity for a transformational leader to come in and say, here's what we need to do differently. And this availability of these dramatic symbols allows us to create, a motivation for change in followers. And it's a chance to sort of, for the leader to articulate what we want people to do. So we should all wear a mask, for example, right? So there is an opportunity for a transformational leader to come in and try to deliver that message. Whether that happens or not is a whole other issue. I guess we'll wait and see. I don't think it's happened yet. And then there are requirements of the internal situation. So organizations have life cycles. A startup is quite different from a company that's been in business for 100 years, right? So there are differences there. You're more likely to get change early on in the organization's life cycle and late than you are in the middle, okay? And presumably you can see why. Early on, a lot of things are up in the air. Nothing's really kind of crystallized, so you have an opportunity to change things then. Later on, maybe things aren't working as well as they used to be, so there again, there's maybe more opportunity to introduce change. Okay, typically when you're dealing with complex tasks where there's no external reward available, it's hard to reward people for complex tasks. It's hard to even know how well they're doing at those complex tasks. So transformational leaders tend to be more effective there. It's easier to motivate somebody engaged in very complex work where where it's harder to reward them for what they do. Then you reward them in other ways based on their values and identifying with the organization. When you have a flexible and organic structure to the organization, that makes it easier for transformational leaders to have an impact. If you think about a very inflexible, bureaucratic organizational structure, things are kind of harder to change inherently just based on the structure. So transformational leaders are going to have a harder time in that context. And same kind of logic for whether an organization is highly bureaucratic or not. So transformational leaders are just, it's harder for them to affect change in highly bureaucratic cultures because the bureaucracy, the function of it is to resist change in a lot of ways. So transformational leaders have to break a lot more in those circumstances to be successful, and that's harder to do. Okay, so we talked about the importance of a vision. So we didn't really talk about what that means. So, we know that vision is central to transformational leaders. So leaders who have vision can be transformational. You really can't be transformational if you don't have a vision, if you don't have a sense of, here's what we want to transform into, right? So you need that vision to be effective. But what is it? What do we mean by that? And how do we develop it? So let me give you some examples here. This is from a while ago. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Who said that? Anybody know? Okay, yeah. Oops. JFK, correct. And John F. Kennedy in the 60s proposed this before this was possible, right? I mean, so, nobody had ever done this before of putting a man on the moon, or, I guess again, it's gendered, but this was from a long time ago. And it wasn't totally clear that the U.S. could be successful doing this, but having this kind of very difficult, challenging vision and specific really galvanized a lot of resources in the country to achieve it. And so almost certainly this would not have happened without the expression of such a clear vision for what they wanted to achieve. Or it would have happened, but maybe later and maybe after some other countries had achieved it. Okay. So what are some factors that make visions effective? Well, number one, a vision should provide an attractive future. It should describe an attractive future that we want to arrive at, that we want to live in. Okay, so the vision, if you have a vision that's worse, that's for a future for the organization that's worse, that's much harder to get people to buy into, right? So if your vision is like, I want to reduce our workforce by 50%, I want to have massive layoffs. Okay, there may be reasons why you want to do that, but that's a tough vision for people to follow and to identify with, right? So that's not likely to be effective. So you want to have an attractive future. You want your vision to be specific, but not so narrow that it allows for no flexibility. So, and that's because often we have to modify our plans. So a vision is not a plan. It's not that specific. There may be multiple ways to achieve a vision. We have to make sure that we allow ourselves that flexibility because you don't know when a particular plan is going to be viable or not, and things might change. So, you might have a vision for, less immigration for the country, and you could have that vision. The vision to build a wall is pretty narrow. I mean, that's very specific. So, either you do it or you don't. And there may be, reasons why it's practically difficult to do that or why it's ineffective to do that for the larger goal. So that's the danger of having a vision that's too narrow or too specific, right? You want it to be specific, but not so much that it allows for no flexibility. So, for example, if Trump had articulated a vision of protecting our southern border without it being tied specifically to a wall, like a wall is one thing that seems from the research maybe not to be super effective, but then there are other things that you could do. So if there had been a more general vision, that would have allowed him for some more flexibility in terms of achieving that vision. But because it was so narrow and specific, that gave him less flexibility around that issue. Okay. Number 3, the vision should be challenging but realistic enough that people will buy into it. So, is it plausible that building a wall across the southern border, is possible? Yes, it's challenging, but I think it's realistic. I think most people believe it could be done, so for people who like the general idea of restricting immigration, they might buy into the vision for that reason. Okay. I'm not, obviously, as an immigrant myself, I'm not endorsing that view, but you have to acknowledge that there are people who believe that that is the right thing to do. Okay. Number 4, a vision that is focused on the future of what the organization can be, not just a comparison to the present state. So it's not enough to say like things aren't working now. You have to provide a vision for what the organization can be. So, just saying things are bad now isn't enough. That's not a vision. That's just a complaint. So you need to, and that could be part of your vision, like, explaining why things aren't working now and why we need to change. That could be part of it, but you have to have a vision for the future. You have to have an end state in mind that you can articulate to followers for that to be successful. Okay. You need to be crystal clear in your vision. So it has to be clear what you're trying to achieve. And, it shouldn't require in-depth explanation. So if your vision is so complex or so technical that you couldn't explain it without going into a ton of detail, then it's not a good vision. Okay, so for visions to be effective, they have to be pretty easy to digest. And that's because, you want to be able to recall the vision really easily. You need to have every employee be able to know what the vision is and be able to recall it on the dime so that it can influence their behavior at work. If your vision is so complicated that or that you either can't remember it or it doesn't make sense to you, then it's not going to influence your behavior. So that's the thing with the vision. It's got to be simple and clear and appealing. And that's how it's going to be effective, because people are going to remember it. They're going to buy into it. It's going to guide their behavior. Okay. So relatedly, it's got to be brief and concise enough to be easily remembered. And it's not going to influence your behavior if you don't remember the vision. Okay. So that's, sorry, a couple more here. All members of the organization and future members of the organization must be able to share your vision. So again, if your vision is primarily targeted at a few constituents within the organization and excluding a bunch of others, then not everybody's going to buy into it. It's not likely to be effective. Again, if your vision is, I want to fire half the people in this organization, that's not going to work too well, right? A lot of people aren't going to buy into that, most likely. That's a tough sell, right? Or if it's focused on, hey, I want to increase profits so our executive team can, see their non-salary compensation increase, right? Like, yeah, that's probably not going to go over too well with most of the organization, right? If that's your vision. And so one thing you want to do as a leader is to put yourself in the shoes of all the different members throughout all levels of the organization and ask yourself, will they buy into my vision? Like, is there something that they'll find inspiring about this vision? And if the answer is no, then it's probably not the best vision that it could be. Let me kind of give you some other examples of visions that I think have been successful. So this is from John F. Kennedy's address to Rice University in 1961 in Texas. So he says, many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked, why did he want to climb it? He said, because it's there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. I mean, that's a pretty cool vision, that it's easy to get enthusiastic about that. It's easy to believe that, this is there's a higher purpose that we're working towards here, right? So, you could think that in terms of getting the population to agree to this massive allocation of resources towards this goal. So this is like taxpayer funded, right? So you need people to buy into it, and this is a great message to get the population of the United States to believe, yeah, this is worth doing. It's worth us devoting all this money and resources towards. Right? It's a good vision. Okay, I'll give you a related example from JFK, same issue. We chose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. So again, it's a good vision. It's a place we want to be. It's specific. It's clear. It's not too complicated. It's not too technical. And this is about flying to the moon. It could be incredibly technical, right? There's a lot of technical detail that could be in there, but it's not. It's not about that. It's values-based, right? So again, it's a good vision here. Let me show you possibly one of the most inspiring leadership speeches that I can think of, certainly, which is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. I'm going to show this to you here, and maybe YouTube is going to say it's copyrighted, so I may have to cut it out after, but let's give it a try.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. And every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Wow, yeah, so that's powerful stuff. It gets me every time. What are the key points here in terms of why that's such an effective speech or delivery of a vision? Well, so there's a clear consistency of message there, right? So it's clear what he's talking about, and there's not a lot, there's no wandering from topic to topic. It's very much all about the same thing. He's talking about these issues in ideological terms, not in kind of specific, or like technical terms, right? So it's about the values, about the importance of these higher kinds of ideas. It's a challenge, so he's not saying it's going to be easy, and that's important. It's got to be a challenge. It's not necessarily about a specific phrase. So Obama used, yes, we can as a specific phrase to kind of capture not only the challenge but the optimism. But there is a challenge there. There are some really obvious delivery factors that work in MLK's advantage here. He's using direct gaze, expressing very strong emotions, positive emotions of hope. He's using imagery, right? He's speaking in a way that that kind of highlights the ideas and makes them more real and influential. So, saying that a state, was it Alabama, sweltering in the heat of injustice. I mean, that's like a very colorful kind of way to describe something, right? So that creates mental images in us. He's using metaphors, right? Talking about, concrete issues rather than abstract issues. So talking about how he wants his children to be able to interact with, with white children in an equal way, right? So that's very concrete. That's not talking abstractly about the principle of equality. That's making it real. He's talking with great clarity. I don't think he stumbles over a single word in the whole speech. He's got great confidence. He's framing the issues in particular ways, right? So it's not about, one group taking advantage of another. It's very much in kind of these or us versus them. It's about these larger principles that bring us all together, right? These bigger kind of shared values that we all have in the United States, right? So it's framing an issue. It could be framed quite differently. It could be framed very much as an us versus them. We want to be equal, and we're going to do whatever it takes to get that equality. But that's not the way he's framing it here. So, again, all of that really contributes to the success, to the influence of this speech. And, it's one of the most famous speeches in American history, if not in world history. So now that's obviously an example from the political sphere, and we could try to pull. I mean, there's kind of similar examples in organizations, just that we don't necessarily have video recordings of them, right? So a lot of this is happening, in organizations. They don't record these speeches necessarily, so it's a little bit harder to find examples from an org context. But anyway, so that's one great way to convey your vision, is to communicate directly with your followers. Visions can also be expressed in org mission statements. So organizations often have mission statements on their websites, and they sometimes convey the actual vision of the organization. Other cases, more like kind of like a marketing type thing or recruitment type thing, where it's maybe not totally aligned with the reality. But let's look at some of these examples. So some organizations describe their core purpose in very values-based terms. So Merck, the pharmaceutical company, their core purpose is to preserve and improve human life, at least according to their website. For Nike, it's to experience the emotion of competition, winning and crushing competitors. For Sony, to experience the joy of advancing and applying technology to the benefit of the public. Walt Disney, to make people happy. That's a nice, very specific core purpose, isn't it? Facebook, to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. Well, I'm not sure that they're doing that necessarily, but that is a nice core purpose. Google, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. So that's also pretty neat mission statement there. Okay, and so if you're interested, always interesting, always worth looking at organizations' websites and checking out their mission or core purpose or whatnot to get a sense of what that organization is about if you're considering working for them. Okay, all right. Last thing I want to do is present to you an exercise that we're going to do, and that is basically for you to construct a vision for yourself. And we can think of this as let's imagine that you have an idea for a startup, and that you're looking for investors. And that's one context. You could also, if that doesn't work for you, if you can't think of a startup, you could also imagine that you're looking to convince people to hire you. So essentially your vision is for what you want your career to be, and you're trying to convince people that you want me on your company, in your company, because of this vision. All right. So I'd like you to construct a brief 1-paragraph personal vision statement. So write that up and think, refer back to all of these principles that we've just covered today. And then I'd also like you to video record yourself delivering your vision, so that you can also work on the delivery factors and practice those. Okay, and just think about it. Now, most of you probably aren't managers right now, but most of you will be a manager in one context or another. Or even if you never, in the very rare cases that or the rare possibility that you may never have a leadership position, you're almost certainly going to be in a position where you need to exercise influence over people. And so this vision exercise can help you achieve that as well, right? So even if you're not a leader in an organization, you still need to, if you're looking for investors in a startup, you're not the leader, but you still need to convince people. So most of us can benefit from these kinds of skills. So not just in terms of constructing a vision, but also delivering the vision. So that's the idea. And so once everybody has written their vision and video recorded it, then we're going to devise some way that we that we share those videos with each other, probably in small groups similar to your discussion groups, and that you'll get feedback on the content of the vision and the delivery of the vision, and then you'll give feedback to other people on the content and delivery of their own visions. Okay, and just keep in mind the features of an effective vision. All right, everyone. I know that was a bit long. Thanks for your attention. I appreciate it, and I hope you found it to be useful or interesting or whatnot. Look forward to the next time, and I look forward to seeing your vision videos. All right, thanks, guys. Take care. Bye.